broadcasting. You can hear us online hopefully now. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome along to our seminar series today, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Tom Brooking, Emeritus Professor Tom Brooking, who most of you will know from around the centre, and looking forward to hearing your presentation today all about sort of environmental transformation in the rural sector in New Zealand. And Tom has so much experience working in this area, so it's bound to be really interesting. So thank you, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope I can live up to that introduction. There is a small snip. I had intended to be 2 years advanced on this project, but I had a heart attack instead. Now, this is not a good way to avoid writing, right? Whatever else you do or don't do, avoid a big medical event and just finish whatever it is first rather than second. But we're slowly recovering, and I'm hopefully going to be able to get underway in a couple of months. I've actually given this talk once already to the History Department of Canterbury, and I've used this whole mode of delivering before, and it seems to work reasonably well, and it's very simple. So hopefully it all goes well. This is a PC, and I'm a Mac person. So if weird and wonderful things happen, you can blame me on that. Yeah. And kia ora koutou, I've sort of said, it's lovely to be here. I think this is the most fantastic centre, and it's the loveliest place to work in compared with any department I've been in, and I've been in one for 40-something years, but it was quite a big one with its ups and downs. There's an awful lot more sort of rivalry and a lot less support. So it's great to be around a place where you just get so much support, and everybody backs everybody else, and bingo, the money keeps coming in. So that's the other wonderful thing. I've got to talk about that just a wee bit towards the finish. What I'm trying to do is go for about 25 minutes, and then we can throw it open for questions. I have done it before and kept it to 25 minutes, so I'm going to equal that record today. Okay, it's nice I can sit down at my stage of life as well. Right here. Hey, worked. Well, you might be wondering about this slightly odd title. It's only a working title. Well, I got it from a famous movie that was made when I was a child. I can't quite remember, but I think it was the late 50s, early 60s. It was called The Sky Above and the Mud Below. It was about the Amazon. And I always thought that was a great title, but I thought it was a bit missing. So mud is talking about the environment, basically, and the modification thereof, which is extraordinary in this country, of all countries, actually. We arguably have one of the world's most rapidly transformed environments anywhere. So that's where the mud bit comes in. It also relates to Jane Campion's famous movie based on Story of a New Zealand River, about growing up in the Kaikoura, North Auckland, where I lived a lot of my adolescence myself up near there. And it sure as hell is muddy, and this city actually was called Mud Eden, right? Till the end of the gold rushes when we started to get some permanent paving down. So mud is a real feature of New Zealand life. Sweat is increasingly the bit that I think I'll be concentrating on. This is going to become a history of work to transform the environment. I think that's essentially what it's about. But if you're going to work that damned hard, and this is something I suppose that's behind a bit of the tension between the urban and rural sectors at the moment, there is this feeling that a lot of urban people, A, have no idea what happens in farming, and B, are lazy so-and-sos in comparison to the hard-working farmer. You'll see the cartoon about this from the 1920s. This is not a new idea. Whatever anybody else tells you, it's an ancient teaching in this country, or not ancient, because it's mainly talking about the European world. My world is earlier, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But there are dreams, and those dreams may have been misplaced, and they may have to be changed, if not at least modified rather dramatically. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to do if we're going to get anywhere near on top of climate change. Well, I'm not going to start sounding like a whole lot of other doomsday merchants yet. So I'm trying to write a different kind of history of the making and potentially the remaking, which is actually now underway in this country, I was only talking to my co-editor from a project that I edited as I was recovering from on cultural history of democracy in Los Angeles. I'm talking about regenerative farming in New Zealand and how it's catching on here, and slowly, painfully, whereas in America it's really taken off. And I explained to him it's partly because agricultural scientists don't like the idea, because it comes from America, one, and two, it's all about the soil, and they are much more interested in grass and growing it and pasture. And regenerative farming has only really started to make progress, and some of the soil scientists went to Australia with the whole neoliberal discussed once the DSIR was shut down. A catastrophe for this country, in my humble opinion. In the early 1990s, a lot of those sorts of scientists went off to Aussie and all sorts of other places. Some of them started to come back, and they've always actually cheered regenerative thing, and indeed a lot of the work I've done with my colleagues on pasture, because we were critical of the grassland science. Like that. No one had ever been critical of them before, for the simple reason they thought they were heroes and increased productivity. That's all that matters, ever, in life. And it's not quite that simple, unfortunately. Okay, and then there's the whole rural society thing. But anyway, if I keep going like this, I'll never get there. So, moving on. Oh, you might be wondering about this here, Emeritus meant to catch the idea of idealised England and the tough pioneer reality of early New Zealand. There was plenty of mud around there and burned trees. Right? New Zealand arguably was the ugliest country on the planet in the early 1900s, because so much of the forest was being destroyed, not by being cut down, but by being burnt down. Something like 90% of our forest was removed by fire. And so it was a pretty scruffy place. The initial paper I wrote on all this stuff way back in my first leave in 1985 was called Larkrise, which is about Oxfordshire and England, and a famous book about growing up there in the late 19th century, to Littledean, which is another name for Oxford in North Canterbury, that a famous sociologist wrote a major study about in 1938. So I've decided that was a little too literary and too Anglo centric for its own good, although I will come back to that point. So, just to give you a quick idea, I'll put my glasses on so I can read this properly. The structure of the book, I'm an historian. I tend to work chronologically. That's the way I was trained, and it kind of makes sense. One thing follows, another damn thing follows another damn thing. As Henry Ford said something like that once to me. Anyway, okay, so a very short prologue. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the first big chapter will be on the Eastern Polynesian Maori land use. Remember that the people who came here weren't Maori, they became Maori. So about 1280 we think is the current date, but it shifts around a bit. It depends what the archaeologists keep finding and refinding. The second one will be about farming and industrialising Britain. And we must remember that this nation's story is very much about the Industrial Revolution and its progress, because the country that was most advanced industrially was Britain, first of all, followed, of course, by the United States and parts of Europe. So there's got to be a fairly big chapter on what on earth was going on in Britain before migrants came here. Then there's going to be a series of chapters on major settler advances, as they saw them at least, and Maori experience, which wasn't all advanced by any stretch of imagination, of all these big things that I've given some lectures about in our new History of Agriculture course we put in this year. Wheat and sheep and wool, refrigeration of meat, including deer in more recent times, dairying and the grasslands revolution, all up to about when this country changes, and dairying takes off in this huge boom that we're still wrestling with right at the moment. And then there's diversification and other agricultural activities that you from here and a lot of the rest of you also work on, especially relating to horticulture, kiwi fruit, viticulture, and the merino revival. These are things where farming has actually done two remarkable things. It's greened to an extent, and it actually makes a profit, which is not always the case in the history of New Zealand farming. And then There's going to be a chapter on the dairy bean, more of which later, and then a little epilogue on the future of New Zealand farming. But the basic problem is I had a lot more energy before the heart attack, so I've got to work out ways of trimming this thing down, making it a little less ambitious. So if you can have some thoughts on that, I'd appreciate them. Right, moving on. Just to remind you that there was an alternative model to ordering things that was brought here from England. It's called the tripartite system, and it was a pyramidal one in which a small number of landowners owned most of the land, a larger group of largely tenant farmers rented the land off them and improved it or not, the case may be. And then there was a great mass of landless labourers at the bottom, people who were desperately poor, most of them, many of whom came here in particular, along with Australia and of course North America and to a lesser extent South Africa. I can hear all these voices listening to the cricket to my amazement this morning. That we won, but I never gave our guys a chance. But hearing all those different voices, you sort of get a bit of a history of the British Commonwealth instantly coming on in front of you. Anyway, this was an attempt from my PhD way back in 1977 to draw a model of what the British system looked like. Drawing the New Zealand model is much more complicated, and it's going to have to be done a lot better next time round, because I do want lots of illustrations in the book, including a few diagrams. And here they are. You see up the top, you've got the gentry, the people with the real money, some of whom had been there since the Norman conquest, and another big lot coming with the Tudors, sort of across that period of the 14th and into the 15th and 16th centuries through there. And they, of course, were much attached to the church. And what happened to many of the younger sons, remember, only one son could own, this is called primogeniture, could own the land. And so the rest had to do something. Where do they go? The army, the navy, colonial administration, and of course the church. That is the Church of England, a state-run church. And an awful lot of the people who came here weren't Anglican. They were Presbyterians, particularly in this part of the world, in Otago, or they were Methodists and at least low church Anglicans in many other parts of the country. Completely different people with different aspirations, and that's one reason why this incredibly hierarchical structure was considerably modified. Not completely, but largely. In the middle, we got the tenant farmers. It's an awful crammed slide, I realise, but it's just trying to give the sense that there's layers upon layers. That's the tenant farmers, guys who still farm wearing ties, an impossibility in New Zealand, but there they were, and were often quite wealthy. And then at the bottom is this huge mass of landless labourers, a group that is collapsing in number as the second half of the 19th century proceeds, and over 100,000 came to New Zealand in the 1870s alone. So they're an important part of the story. They were really all Methodists, or Baptists, or low church Anglicans. They were nothing to do with that gentry mob at the top, who have been wildly inflated by a lot of historians, and more recent research has shown that although they're important, of course, and powerful and rich, many of them, nevertheless, they didn't really survive that far into the 20th century, which is more about family farming on a more modest scale. Okay, the prologue. Three sort of key questions I'm really interested in here. And this also gives me a chance to get into a bit of deep time and pretend to be a geologist. Just pretend for about 10 pages, isn't it? And arguing that nature, God, providence, whatever, did not necessarily intend New Zealand to become a giant stock farm for Britain. This is just purely the accident of who arrived here from Europe first and in greatest number. And it's the English at about half, Scots at 21%, and the Irish at about 18-19%. the majority of whom were Catholic from Southern Ireland, but there was an important Protestant minority as well. So there was a simple environmental determinism that really underpinned the huge production and productivity that happened in New Zealand from the 1920s down to what they call the grasslands revolution, or that's what some was called. And so this chapter will point out that New Zealand's roughly 83 to 85 million time alone. There's no particular reason why this should become an ideal country for stock farming, especially not when it's one of the best countries in the world for growing trees. So there you have a sort of a tension straight off. Secondly, I want to ascertain how far Aotearoa New Zealand unfolded as an imperial project, and who drove this development? Who were the actors as well as the factors driving this huge transformation? It's arguably one of the fastest and most extensive anywhere ever. And once we start talking about centre and periphery, well, there might be better ways to look at it, because we helped change what was going on in Britain as well. It's a two-way process, and that's what comes out of the work of people like John Darwin at Oxford, Tony Valentine here at Otago, and Alan Lester and other important English historians. And the third big thing here, I want to connect the economic and environmental history approaches, using William Cronin, the famous American environmental historian's work on Chicago, where he argues the city created the country rather than the other way around. Now, there's a tension here because one of the big thinkers behind my progress as an historian is a guy called Raymond Williams. He's arguably one of the most famous anthropologists of all time, working on European type societies. And he's always argued that there was a thing called ruralism which dominated British migrations around the empire, and that people who came here were desperate to get away from huge, overcrowded, dangerous, stinking, horrible cities and live in a nice, bucolic countryside. Why else would you hop on a ship the size of a slightly overgrown yacht and undertake the longest migration voyage in history? Anywhere. New Zealand is further away from anywhere than anywhere. And those of you who come from America or Asia or Europe will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. Anyway, that's the prologue, if I can make it go. Oh, there we are. Key themes running through all chapters. Okay, I do not want to write the celebratory history because there is much to criticise. On the other hand, I do not want to rubbish and condemn everything that's been attempted by farmers, which I think is partly behind a lot of the tensions that are bursting out all over the place at the moment. So it's going to be critical, but not declensionist, okay? It's a matter of getting that balance right. You've got to give credit where credit's due for. For example, at the moment, a lot of dairy farmers are actually doing pretty well and trying hard, but there's other idiots out there that are continuing to ruin all the good work that others are doing. And you've got to find that balance. And so we need dialogue going instead of people shouting, which never works very well. Okay, it certainly has to be transdisciplinary, and that's the lovely thing about environmental history. It has to be transdisciplinary, and it's the lovely thing about being here, by the way. I think that's what's so exciting about this centre, is set up by you and many others, and then Janet's great work, and now Caroline continuing, and so on. It's just terrific. And throughout, I want to connect with British and New World historiographies and build on the work of some New Zealand pioneers, people like Rollo Arnold, Jim Gardner from Canterbury. And I'm calling to thin New Zealand historiography because here's a strange contradiction. A country so dependent upon agriculture and farming for its economic survival and success, we don't have a rich agricultural history. It's erratic, it's uneven. Sure, we've got quite a lot of nice family histories about giant runs and so on, but there's all kinds of gaps and holes. And a lot of you I know are working on some of these big lacuna, or lacuna, I suppose, if we're going to be strict with that. And so the end result of that is historiography that just needs to be embellished a lot. Same is true about urban history. So two of the most important parts of our story are both wildly underwritten and very unevenly written. Okay. Some of the themes that are going to keep coming through. Ecological cost, something that hasn't come through much. And this affects other parts of the world as well, as we're now seeing with the Pacific, particularly Nauru and Ocean Island, that supplies with a phosphate that's behind the huge productive increases of the interwar period and the post-World War II period. The huge business of social cost of large-scale Maori land loss, again, coming right to the fore in this country. And at long last, it took us over 40 years, many of us, both academics and school teachers, to get New Zealand history teaching made compulsory in schools. Over 40 years of battle. Why? So long, partly because boys' schools, big posh ones in particular, were determined they only wanted to teach their students about Tudor Stuarts. And they didn't want to teach the kids anything about what they did, which always struck me as bizarre, crazy, and dumb, basically. But it took a long time to change the bureaucracy and move things along. And there's a lot of challenges to go. That story's not over. And boy, you watch it get hot and hysterical as is happening. Okay, I want to open a wider conversation between social scientists and frequently reductionist agricultural applied scientists who like to think that everything they did was heroic, whether it was or it wasn't. And I wanted to show the representation. So it's going to have a lot of illustrations and maps, terribly important. Historians, nice to have a couple of geographers here, need maps as much as anybody else. And most history let down by one thing in particular, the awful maps. And having become an environmental historian, I've learned to work with geographers and appreciate more. But there's also paintings, photographs, posters, covers, and you'll see lots of that. Okay, like that one, for example. We could have a silly quiz question here. Who is that idealised farmer modelled on? Which Hollywood star?
James, no, that was the brand.
No, it could be early James. Yeah. Anyway, but we'll talk about that later. But there it is, and what's in the background? St Paul's.
And driving Massey Ferguson.
Yes.
I recognise it.
Of course, it's driving a bloody Massey Ferguson. I nearly killed myself on one of my student jobs. I know all about those damn things. Yeah, but St Paul's at the top. See, so this is 1946. The Journal of Agriculture, we are producing food for Hungry Britain. And that's what's going to make us rich. Okay. That was basically the line. And here, look at this, the British industrial worker. Britain thought it was going to become a major industrial power after the war. A little bit wrong, but that was the idea. It's actually a film on right now in the film festival about that vision made by a famous English filmmaker, but it's his son producing a movie about his father's work. But that was the vision in the late 40s, and there's a farmer shaking hands with the industrial worker across the little distance between New Zealand and Britain. This is why some historians argue, New Zealand sort of developed from the 1890s, 1900s, early 1900s into a kind of extra province of Britain, not just a colony, but a kind of extension immediately attached to London in a strange way. And this, of course, is just to show you where the old, ancient Gondwana abuts productive New Zealand at Lake Tiana, which was all developed there, the farming country, in the 1960s, not that long ago. So within my lifetime, and we even had student long essays on that particular topic, and how they managed to change that country. But of course, that's about as far as they could get. But one thing that interests you, if you're a walker, like I guess a lot of us are in this room, is where stock find themselves, or where we find stock when we're walking in the most remote parts of the country. Suddenly you'll see some sheep or cattle. Well, we've tried to use every single inch of the place. as we would have said in the imperial. And apples, of course, comes a bit later. It's a big take off in the 1920s, and that, of course, hadn't guessed it, is a 1920s investment. And this is my favourite. 1946 again, the New Zealand, 47, sorry, it's the New Zealand family farm, epitomised, complete with dog, right? And it just goes to show the idealisation. And what colour are they, and what ethnicity? Well, they look like sort of failed actors from a bad American Western. But that tells you an awful lot about how people are thinking of these things. And then, of course, we've got Maori working at the same time in difficult country and on poor quality land. Okay, so in other words, I'll be arguing that rural New Zealand is not a middle, but a flashpoint of race and gender relations. So I'm talking about a contested history that's still being contested, that's alive and vibrant, and it's not something that's all over. There was this great hope in New Zealand, like New Zealand, during 3/4 of the 20th century, that Maori would be assimilated and would stop worrying about being Maori. Well, it didn't happen at all, dead opposite. But that helps explain a lot of the tensions. There was an idea that started being pushed by American agricultural historians from 2009 at various conferences of the Agricultural History Society. I went to some of them. And this idea kept coming up, but New Zealand's not quite a post-rural society yet. We'll talk about that. And I want to examine shifting social structures. So that hierarchy to much flatter structure, and in defiance of Marx, only to start reversing as agribusiness intrudes. So maybe Marx.
You get it on speaker, I'll just watch the slides.
Oh, what? Ooh, someone had their microphone on. Okay, that happens with Zoom, folks. Anyway, I also want to, if we're worried about that one, I'll happily talk to you about it. The really late emergence of notions of wilderness. We only got worried about wild rivers after the Second World War, as recently as that, and saving them. So that is quite a late kind of development. There's a couple of Australian historians, one basically Tom Griffith, very famous environment historian. He's a guy that's written more about Australian gunfires than anybody else. And Richard Waterhouse is more a rural and agricultural historian. About the importance of studying institutions, local museums, agricultural and pastoral societies or their equivalents elsewhere, and also the impact of transport and communication technologies. And there was an amazing book that I only read recently called The Bush, and also Tom clean out of my head, but it'll come back to me in a second, who was one of the major advisors to various Australian Labor Prime Ministers. And it's a complete condemnation on the way in which white Australians wrecked a very fragile ecology, which was producing the best grass ever seen anywhere in the world for sheep as well as kangaroos. But the kangaroo part of it, of course, got shut down very quickly. Okay, and trains, planes, all these means of transport, and a motor car have to be quite an important part of this particular story. Okay, and I want to interrogate paintings and cartoons, literature, pastoral novels. People like Morris Shadbolt wrote a few. Frank Anthony wrote numerous ones called Me and Gus, which are very anti-heroic. Movies, TV, company calendar, and people like Baz McDonald and advertising via Toyota. So here's some idyllic paintings from the late 19th, early 20th century of southern farming and South Otago farming, and this is what people hoped they'd be able to live in a nice farmhouse on a very pretty and aesthetically pleasing, in the English sense, farm. And this is the Empire Marketing Board, the way that it promoted New Zealand to English housewives, that's what they were called back then, who would hopefully buy New Zealand butter and cheese and lamb. And it's all somewhat inaccurate. Which is hardly surprising when these poor gentlemen who did this, but they're all men, I hate to tell you, who did these paintings, had never seen New Zealand or even looked at pictures of the place. So this is an imperial fantasy. And here's another one. This is dairying in New Zealand. That's supposed to be Mount Taranaki in the background. Okay, so you start to get an idea that it's a bit wobbly. And that's the old style dairying up to the First World War was all carried out on horseback. From the 1920s, it's all about trucks and much bigger dairy factories and much more industrialised in every sense of the word. And here's the cartoon I told you about. Here's the little weedy businessman from the city, very suspicious type. I say, get on with the job. Probably had a voice, something like that. And big, tough woodsman, who could be Pat Murray even, says, I suppose I'll have to alone because you don't look as if you could help. So, yeah, that goes to show some of these old tensions. Much more recently, we had a program on this year, made by the son of a Southern farmer with a genuine Southern accent, which, by the way, probably comes from Celtic speech, right, rather than anything else. I realised today when watching that time race along called Baz McKenzie, appropriately enough. I would recommend it. It's very critical. It is not a homage to the dairy boom at all. It's a critique of it, but a fair-minded one. And if you want to watch something good on telly in relation to this, it's great. Whereas Country Calendar is a little bit idealistic. And then, of course, it's Barry Crump advertising Toyota. Dreadful man, by the way, but as a human being, absolute shocker. But he was great for selling Toyotas. And then, of course, we got these terrible contradictions. So you can see all this beautiful wild New Zealand, and you look across the paddock next door, and suddenly you see cows where they didn't have enough fences, doing what cattle always do when they get into water, which is two things at least. Okay, so nearly there. In conclusion, I want to reread our local and family histories. There's a lot of those around to try and understand what they're really arguing a bit better than what we had last time. The New Zealand Farmer, marvellous paper full of extraordinary illustrations and very interesting and quite progressive, actually. New Zealand Country Journal comes out of Canterbury. New Zealand Farmer is Northern, comes out of Auckland. But it covers the whole country. New Zealand Country Journal is Canterbury, and it's more limited, but there's some interesting stuff in there, but it only lasts for 20 years or so. The Otago Witness, which lasts longer, has lots and lots of rural New Zealand. New Zealand Journal of Agriculture goes from about 1910 to the 1990s. And we have all these amazing state documents, New Zealand yearbooks, the census, which was really useful up to about 1986, it's got a lot more problematic since, and agricultural stats, which go to about 1981 in a comprehensible, simple fashion. In the epilogue, we'll talk about this dairy boom, industrial agriculture, overseas ownership, and the opposite swing to organic and local production. And at the heart of it, this extraordinary resurgence that most progress still don't know about of Maori farming and the emergence of the tinny farm economy, which is so exciting and interesting because by applying a whole different philosophy to land use, they're coming up with a generally more green approach without being too flaky about it. They're hard-nosed businessmen, these guys too, and they want it to pay, but it's working surprisingly well. And then I might end making some comparisons with his recent book, Farming Inside Invisible Worlds, and the publication that Eric Pawson and other parts of the Martin-funded group on biological futures produced. So that's where that's going. And the one quick thing, afterthought prompt, there are now over 350 mainly Pākehā families that have been farming their land for over 100 years. All that information is now available down the lines. It would be fantastic to get someone to actually analyse it reasonably carefully and as much detail as they could. So if anybody's got any ideas about where I might start looking around to find some thesis funding for such a project, let me know. It would just be a lovely, nice basis for such a Okay, oh, wait a minute. Thank you for attending to that. Questions? Okay, far away.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions from our online folk, then just
Yes.
perhaps raise your hand or just speak up, might be easier at this point. But do you have any questions from anyone in the room?
Tom, I think you've been there about 20 years.
I know, and I'm not going to last that long. I know. But I might have to be a team that time. We have people like one morning team. I don't know. Anyway, yes.
But just one question really with my kind of climate change awareness hat on, and that is when you're talking earlier about the ecological impacts of farming, and you're talking about no and obviously the fertiliser extraction, then I mean, you can just broaden from there and think about, you know, the transfer of those degradations to now the use of fossil fuels to make fertiliser and the implications of that for the environment and those broader environmental implications. I mean, it goes on, and so those ecological impacts, I don't know how far you intend to explore them, but it's.
I mean, yeah, you've got North Africa and you've got Chile too. I realise that, and a whole lot of other similar places where these sorts of appalling mining activities are going on. Of course, across the Tasman, they got Australia, which is, I'm going to get that man's name, it's still coming to me, it's close. He's written this absolutely wonderful book, and it's beautifully written. It's one of the best pieces of non-fiction I've ever read. He also written about Highlanders and Victorian appalling things they did to the local Aboriginal population. So he's not uncritical.
I was just thinking, if you're looking at farming as a continuum over time, then I think a lot of those ecological impacts are coming home to roost right now.
Yes.
And this is a point of inflection in the history of farming, because there are going to be enormous changes which are occurring over the current decades that we're in, that are going to lead to an extraordinarily different future.
So plenty of work for everybody in the room.
Yes.
I guarantee that. Yes. Yeah.
I guess I was really interested in what you're saying about New Zealand's history as it was idealised, or it was as presented in, you know, imperial propaganda, but then New Zealand's history as it actually is. I'm just quite interested, how much of a difference do you think there is between the two? And I ask this because I've been, I guess, reading more about history than I have in the past, and I see this is a common theme in other nations as well, where there is this kind of idealised notion of what we are, of what they are, that they put forward. And then, you know, down the track, when people realize things aren't that good, they tend to look back and glorify those old days as well and try to return to them, but whether they exist or not. So I'm just curious, how much of a difference do you think there is between our history as we think it and how it actually was?
Okay, since historians have started ripping into major issues concerning ecology, environment, gender, race, and class, which is old, all sorts of awkward and difficult questions have been raised, and the whole idealisation, well, that's interesting in its own right. I mean, you can pick that apart as an idealisation, but those idealisations, wherever, from whenever, from whoever, I think are all up for critique, and that's making the only danger with that is that history becomes so overtly critical, and that's what I mean. You can't, if you go too far, you're going to drive people away and make them say, "Oh, it's just a white basher, or a bloke basher, or whatever," and so you need to try and maintain some sort of balance. And it's reasonable to say this is what they thought they were doing. This is actually what they did do, which is what this amazing Aussie book, The Bush, tells us all about. And so they actually wrecked the best pasture Australia's ever had because the Aboriginals did it. Yeah, and so modern Victoria is an ecological catastrophe. And it's one reason why it has all these terrible bushfires, along with everything else that's going on. So yeah, it's a question of balance, but not so much that you lose the critique. So it's got to be done well, it's got to be well written, and it's got to have lots of, and so much easier to do now, illustrative material to reinforce and support. And it's everywhere, that illustrative material, and everything.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I certainly wish you well with what's a rather large undertaking.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, it's probably a double question, but I really was interested in your concept that you said came from Chicago about the city creating the countryside.
Yeah.
And obviously that makes a lot of sense, but was there a tension in 19th century New Zealand between that type of domestic supply versus supply for England? In other words, were there two competing narratives as to who the market was?
No, not really, because the big market was England, and the pathetically small market was New Zealand. So you're going to have some kind of overseas market. Before England, it was Australia, and to a lesser extent, the west coast of the United States. So we had, even when my farming had its first boom, was wheat in the 1830s and 40s, it was exporting to Sydney, Hobart, and San Francisco. And quite quickly, white farmers started to do the same kind of thing, but with this huge, refrigeration, I should have said a bit more about, because 1882 changes the world, for New Zealand. Suddenly this huge market that we could never fully supply becomes available. And all we need with the local one is just to top up, our sales a bit. But suddenly, especially at the same time, steamships are really taken off at exactly the same point. So transport technologies improved. Suddenly got the means of being able to freeze your frozen meat and your butter and cheese and stick it in a ship, and it will get there usually. And increasingly faster and more often with a steamship than a sailing ship. So there's these extraordinary conjunctions that are going on. So I don't think those two narratives ever had much of a battle, except for manufacturing trying to get started from the cities. And where were we going to export that stuff to? Nobody wanted to have some clunky stuff made in the colonies. So it basically meant you were limited to your local sales. And people like Fish and Piper managed to find a tiny little niche that they could squeeze into. But these were small niches compared to this vast. That's why I showed you those couple of posters. There was this idea that the British market was massive, endless, and seems that people who came here were great believers in things being endless. They thought the forest was for a long time. Even into the 20th century, even after the Kora had more or less been completely chopped down or burnt down, people had the idea that the New Zealand forest was so huge that they could go on abusing it as well as using it for as long as they liked. And the same with the market. It had endless possibilities. Very quickly, of course, things like Britain joining I think they called it the EEC at the time, didn't they? In 1973-4, it's a bit complicated. It takes a couple of years to nail it down. But around there was such a blow to this traditional New Zealand order. And that's what forced so many innovations, things like kiwi fruit, hugely improved apple production and changing apples into ones of different kind of new markets like Japan or whatever wanted. There was this sudden requirement for a huge adjustment that we're still trying to come to terms with, actually. So, yeah, that's an interesting question, but I think that was a reasonably sensible answer. I hope it was.
Tom, can I insert myself there?
Oh, I was waiting for that beautiful voice to come booming in. Okay, far away.
I don't know whether anyone else in the room can hear me, but look, following up to that, I think I appreciate your caution about how you're going to have to weave between two poles, between glorifying and encouraging the history of rural New Zealand and also not upsetting people. And I think that there's probably, I'm interested that there's probably two different constituencies that you're going to have to avoid upsetting. I don't see how you're going to avoid upsetting them, by the way, Tom. One is sort of like farming folk, farming industries, politicians and representatives more generally, who do still, as we can see recently, trade on a remarkably rose-tinted, progress-oriented view of New Zealand rural history. And that will play out as it does, Tom. If they have pictures of you on their next protest, then I think you've probably done a good job. But the other group is actually other academics.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind that Empires of Grass, the wider Environmental Histories Project, the work you've done, I can see Paul Starr out there. Hello, Paul. And our beloved departed Peter Holland. I mean, I thought in Empires of Grass, you let agricultural scientists off with a very coded set of critiques. I wouldn't say let them off, but you gently steered diplomatically around the role that agricultural science had played in the destructive colonisation of New Zealand and its ecological catastrophes. And the way in which you're describing this book, I can't see you being able to get away with that this time. I think it's going to be much more confronting for agricultural scientists, this book.
Challenge for you, Tom.
Okay, well, we can all hear you, by the way, Hugh, it's your voice. So yeah, and yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. In the first version of Environmental Histories, we had Kevin O'Connor involved, who of course represented the older world, but he was an interesting fellow because although he came from Lincoln and he trained at Cornell in the United States, he also had trained as a Jesuit priest. So whenever I had a problem, he used to say to me, Occam's razor. And my daughter's just given me a book called that, written by a philosopher. But the simple idea is, well, the simpler something is, the more useful it's liable to be. And, you know, and less is more, rather than the other way around. And so somehow or other, I've got to use Occam's razor without cutting people open, which is a tricky thing to do. So I'm going to use, and whoever keeps this thing going, it's going to have to use lots of readers to make sure that they don't, you know, end up in court or somewhere like that, or being sued, because it's starting to happen more in New Zealand now. There was the odd slip up in a book I remember on New Zealand diplomats that a very good historian wrote, where she suggested a certain New Zealand diplomat had behaved very badly on a tennis table, table tennis table, and she had to drop all that stuff because she was being sued big time. So it's starting to happen. The guy who wrote the history of Otago Boys High also ranted the same thing about a certain rector's misbehaviour. So I suppose there's a moral there about what you stay well away from. But yeah, it's not an easy one to answer, and I'm afraid you're going to have to read some stuff and let me know how offensive or not you think I've been, and whether it's been done elegantly and academically appropriately. Yes, we have another question back.
But if you're being true to the idea, wouldn't the point be to be offensive? Because without that, like, we can just look at the COP26 summit and all the young people are saying, like, you're doing all the same thing, you're pushing everything. So on the veil of, like, we shouldn't get them like too extreme, we're doing the same thing. So isn't this the same then?
Okay. All right. Yes, all right. Toughen up is what you're doing. I've already been told this by some other people when I did the same talk to the Canterbury History Department. Certainly a young married woman there got stuck in about needing to be more tough. So
I'll echo that and just say, also think about the audience. You're not running for an audience today, you're running for an audience when the book is released. And
that's right.
Things will change, and things, well, if you're right, if we're right in general, things will continue to get more and more challenging. And so you'll have the benefit of having recent events hopefully prove you right as well. And so I guess it's, yeah, don't pull the punches too much, but also don't get sued to the point where you can't release the book. So there's another line to,
Yeah,
to walk there.
all right.
It's only defamation if it's not true.
That's right.
Yeah. That's it. But then,
Well said.
yeah,
That's well said. Yeah, well, I mean, I know that what you're writing your thesis about is a little bit controversial in places, so you probably already looked at some of them.
Tom, just a very last sort of more light-hearted note for me. As a child of the 80s, I remember, when we had 2 TV channels and, I grew up in the city. So, the only thing I knew about rural communities was watching the dog show, and everyone watched the dog show. It was just absolutely compulsive viewing.
Yeah, I remember that.
Mainly because of the narrator, the guy that did the voiceover, because he was absolutely brilliant. He had that dry sense of humour, and it was classic stuff. And I think that the dog show went on to sort of inform the way Spates developed the Southern Man concept.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Very much that sort of bloke type thing. But anyway, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that. I'm sure we've all got lots more questions for you, but we'll let you rest now.